She threw herself in front of the horse before anyone could stop her. The animal screamed. The stage lurched sideways. And Clara Whitmore, soaking wet hatless, holding nothing but a worn leather satchel, stood in the mud of Red Rock's only street, with her arms spread wide, her jaw set hard, and her eyes burning like she dared the world to come at her again. The town went silent. Ethan Calloway didn't move. He just stared at the woman he had agreed to marry, this stranger, this nobody, and felt something shift in his chest that had no name yet. If you love stories about broken people finding their way back to each other, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The stage was 40 minutes late. Ethan had counted every one of those minutes, standing beside the hitching post outside Donnelly's station, his hat low. His arms crossed his jaw, working a piece of nothing, because he needed something to do with his body besides pace. He wasn't a man who paced. Pacing was for men who didn't know what they wanted. Ethan Calloway knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted his land back. He wanted the 47 acres his father had broken his spine over the creek that ran cold and clean along the eastern fence, the house with the crooked porch rail he'd never gotten around to fixing, because fixing it felt too permanent, too much like admitting he was staying. He'd always meant to leave Red Rock, had told himself that for 12 years. And now Silas Mercer was going to take everything from him in exactly 6 days unless Ethan showed up to the county land office with a marriage certificate and a wife standing beside him. A wife. The word felt like a splinter under his thumbnail. He didn't need a wife. He needed a signature. The arrangement had been made through a broker in San Antonio, a man named Galt, who smelled like boot oil and kept his office too dark for Ethan's comfort. The woman's name was Clara Whitmore. Age 28. No family listed. Previous residence, El Paso Border Settlement. Occupation domestic. The paper Galt had slid across the desk told him almost nothing, which Ethan had decided to take as acceptable. He didn't need her history. He needed 6 months of legal marriage while he built the case against Mercer's forged deed, and then should she choose, she could take the agreed-upon payment and go wherever a woman with a fresh start wanted to go. Clean, simple, temporary. That was the plan. Then the stage came around the bend in a spray of red mud, the horses wild-eyed from the storm that had been chasing the plane since morning. And before the driver even pulled the brake handle all the way down, the door swung open and a woman dropped out into the street like she couldn't stand being contained 1 second longer. And then she stopped that horse. She hadn't hesitated. The lead animal from the opposite team, a half-broke roan that had come loose from a poorly tied hitching rail 2 doors down, came charging directly toward the stage, toward the crowd that had gathered to watch the arrival, toward the 3 children standing open-mouthed near the barber shop door. Clara Whitmore stepped directly into its path, arms out, voice rising in a sharp, commanding tone that cut through the wind and the panic and the screaming of a woman somewhere behind Ethan. "Whoa! Easy. Easy now." The horse slowed, skidded, blew hard through its nostrils, and stopped. Clara stood there with mud on her boots up to the ankle and her dark hair half undone from whatever careful arrangement it had started the morning in, and she turned to look at the children by the barber shop with an expression that wasn't pride or relief. It was just calm, like she had done this before. Like the world throwing runaway horses at her was not particularly remarkable. One of the children, a little girl no older than 7, started clapping. Nobody else did. "Border girl," a man near Ethan said. Low, but not low enough. Mercer was right. Calloway's gone and scraped the bottom of the barrel. Ethan turned his head toward the voice. "Pete Alden. Owns the feed store. Has a wife who irons his collar every morning and a mouth that runs 20 hours a day." Ethan looked at him for exactly long enough to make the man shift his weight, then looked back at Clara. She was walking toward him. She'd heard. He could tell by the slight elevation of her chin. Not arrogance, something harder than that, something earned. She'd heard, and she had decided not to react, and somehow that was more striking than if she had. She stopped 2 feet in front of him. Up close, she was not what the word domestic had prepared him for. There was nothing soft about her face. Not cruel, not mannish, but decided. Like someone had taken a woman who had been very beautiful in a gentle way and put her through several years of weather until the softness burned off, and what remained was something cleaner and more durable. Her eyes were gray, not the pale gray of river ice, but the darker gray of the sky just before a storm decides what it wants to be. "Mr. Calloway," she said. Her voice was steady, not warm, not cold, just there, like creek water. "Miss Whitmore," he said. A silence passed between them that had too many questions inside it. "You're wet," he said finally. Because he had to say something, and it was the most observable fact. "It rained," she said. "All the way from San Antonio, most of it." She shifted the satchel from one hand to the other. It was light. Too light for a woman carrying her entire life into a marriage of convenience. "Is there somewhere I can change before we—" She paused. "Before whatever comes next." "I'll take you to the house." "The ranch house." "Yes." "Where we'll live," she said. Not a question exactly, more like she was laying out the facts in front of herself and checking them. "For the time being," he said. Something moved across her expression. Not hurt, more like recognition. Like she'd expected that, and was noting that she'd been right to. 6 months, she said. That was the agreement. "And your land is worth 6 months of your time," he said. "Yes, and you'll be compensated, same as Galt explained." "He explained very little," Clara said, "but I understood enough." She looked at the town around her, at Pete Alden still standing too close listening, at the women on the other side of the street who had stopped pretending to shop, at the sheriff leaning in his doorway with his thumbs in his belt and his expression somewhere between curious and dismissive. "They don't like me already," she said. "They don't know you," Ethan said. "In a town like this, those are the same thing." He didn't argue with that, because she was right. The ranch was 4 miles out of town, and the wagon ride took them through country that was still shaking off the storm. Water running in shallow cuts across the road. The air smelled like wet sage and turned earth. Clara sat on the bench beside him without speaking, her satchel on her lap, her hands folded on top of it. She watched the land. Ethan watched the road, and occasionally her watching the land. "Creek runs along the east fence," he said eventually. He didn't know why he told her that. "I heard the water when we crossed the low bridge," she said. "It's a good sound." He looked at her. "My grandmother had a well," she said, not looking at him. "I used to fall asleep listening to it." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. The house came into view, and he felt, as he always did, a complicated thing in his chest when he saw it. It was not a grand house. It had never pretended to be. 1-story wood and adobe, mixed the way his father had built things, practical first, everything else later. The porch rail still crooked. The window on the south side still had the cracked pane he'd meant to replace last autumn. Clara got down from the wagon before he could move to help her. He wasn't sure if that was independence or if she simply didn't expect help. He showed her the house, the kitchen, the main room, the bedroom, and then there was the pause he'd been dreading, the place where the arrangement had to become real in a way that words in Galt's dark office hadn't required. "There's a second room," he said. "Small. I've been using it for storage, but I've cleared it." She looked at him. "I cleared it yesterday," he added in case she thought he'd done it just now. "You cleared a room," she said slowly, "for me to sleep in." "That's the arrangement," he said. "You need to be clear. Mr. Calloway." Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge that made him stop. "I am very clear. I have been clear about what kind of arrangement this is since I signed the papers. I am not confused." "I didn't mean to suggest—" "You suggested it," she said, "by explaining it before I asked." She tilted her head slightly. "Is that a problem men usually have? Or just you?" He stared at her. She turned and walked toward the small room with her satchel, and he stood in the doorway of the main room alone and thought, this woman is going to be difficult. He was not wrong. "Judd," The first week was a negotiation conducted entirely without words. Clara learned the kitchen by herself, which was fine. She woke before he did, which he noticed because the smell of coffee was always present when he came in from the early chores. She didn't comment on the condition of the root cellar, which was poor, but he found it reorganized on the third day without any discussion of the fact. She took the laundry without being asked on the fourth day, and he came home to find it dry and folded on the table, and he couldn't tell if this was generosity or just a woman who couldn't stand disorder. She was also watching him. He could feel it. Not in a calculating way, in the way a person watches an environment they're not yet sure about, like she was taking a census of small things and deciding what they meant. He caught her watching him fix the fence on the north edge of the property on the fifth day. She was standing at the kitchen window, and when he looked up, she didn't look away. She just waited to see if he'd look away. He did. That evening she set 2 cups on the table. He hadn't asked for coffee after supper. She hadn't either. But there they were. He sat down. She sat across from him. They both drank. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked. "My father built the first structure in 1851. I was born here." "And Mercer?" He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "You know about Mercer." "Galt told me enough to understand why you needed a wife by a specific date. He did not tell me Mercer's method." Ethan set down the cup. "Mercer acquired a land deed 2 months ago through the county office. Document shows a purchase agreement dated 1864 that gives him ownership of 300 acres, including mine. But I know my father never sold that land. He died on it, and there was no purchase in 1864 because my father had 3 witnesses at the county office confirm his continuous ownership in 1865. And those witnesses, 2 dead, 1 moved to Colorado." He paused. Conveniently, Clara was quiet for the moment. Then, "What does the deed look like?" "The document." "Yes, have you seen it?" "I've seen a copy Mercer's lawyer filed with the court." "Does the paper match the period?" "The ink." "The notary seal." He looked at her more carefully. "Why?" She wrapped both hands around her cup. "In El Paso, I worked for 3 years as a bookkeeper for a land broker. Not a good man. I watched him create purchase agreements that looked 40 years old when they were 40 days old." She met his eyes. "I know what a forged deed looks like, Mr. Calloway. If you can get me a copy of that document, the original copy, not a transcription, I can tell you within an hour if it's real." The silence in the kitchen shifted. Ethan stared at her. "That wasn't in anything Galt told me," he said. "Galt didn't ask," she said simply. He got her the document. It took 2 days a ride to town, a conversation with the court clerk, who owed him a debt of the quiet kind, and a careful copy made by hand. Clara sat at the kitchen table with the copy and a lamp, and 3 things she'd pulled from her satchel: a small magnifying lens, a worn notebook, and a piece of what appeared to be very old paper that she used as a comparison. She worked in silence for 40 minutes. Ethan sat across the room and tried to read, and failed entirely. "The notary seal is wrong," she said. He looked up. The county notary in 1864 would have been James Aldridge. He died in 1866. His seal had a particular defect, a slight crack in the outer ring. Every document he stamped carries it. She set down the lens. "This seal is clean. No crack. Whoever made this document either didn't know about the cracked ring, or used a newer seal and hoped no one would look." She looked at him. "Someone would have to look." "You looked." "I looked." She sat back. "There are 2 other problems. The paper grain is too fine for 1864 county supply, and the iron gall ink used in the signature line shows no browning at the edges, ink that old would have oxidized differently." She folded her hands. "This document was made within the last 5 years, maybe 3. Ethan sat very still. "Can you write that down?" he said. "Everything you just said, with specifics, in a form that a court could read." "I can write it," she said. "Whether a court will listen is a different question. One problem at a time." he said. She looked at him for a moment. And then, not a smile exactly, but the closest thing to one he'd seen from her, something lightened in her face. One problem at a time, she agreed. The town took its position quickly. By the second week, Red Rock had decided what it thought about the arrangement between Ethan Calloway and the border woman. The women who came into Harmon's dry goods on Tuesday mornings decided it loudly enough that Clara could hear them from 2 aisles over. 6 months, said Vera Dutton, who had been the leading authority on other people's marriages for 30 years. That's all. Then she'll take whatever he pays her and disappear back where she came from. If she lasts that long, said another voice. Mercer's already told half the county Calloway's desperate. Man takes a bride from a border settlement. She stopped that horse, said a quieter voice, young, uncertain. A pause. Animals and women with nothing to lose, Vera said. Both'll do reckless things. Clara came around the end of the aisle with her basket and her grocery list, and walked directly past the 3 women without altering her pace or her expression. She set her items on the counter. She counted out exact change. She thanked the man at the counter by name. She'd learned his name on the first visit, and she walked out. Outside, she stood for a moment on the sidewalk with her basket. A little girl tugged on the hem of her jacket, the same child from the stage arrival. Up close, she had freckles and a gap where a front tooth used to be. I liked how you stopped that horse, the girl said. Clara looked down at her. It seemed like the thing to do, Clara said. Mama says you're not staying. Lots of people say lots of things. Are you staying? Clara looked down the street at the far end, where if she looked long enough, she could see the faint outline of the direction that led back to the ranch. Back to the crooked porch rail and the cold creek and the kitchen table where she and Ethan Calloway had sat last night in silence that was somehow less hostile than most conversations she'd had in years. I don't know yet, she said honestly. The girl nodded like this was acceptable and ran back to wherever she'd come from. Mercer came on a Thursday. He arrived at the ranch in a good coat, with 2 men behind him, and a smile that Ethan recognized immediately as the kind of smile that believed it had already won. Clara was in the kitchen. She stayed there, but she listened. Calloway, Mercer said from the porch, not bothering to knock, standing at the open door like he owned the threshold. Heard you took a wife. I did, Ethan said. Border woman. Mercer tilted his head. Interesting choice for a man who needs to appear respectable to the land office. My wife is respectable, Ethan said. And she's standing in my kitchen, in my house, on my land, which is where she'll be when the land office reviews our marriage certificate next week. Mercer's smile didn't move. You think a certificate changes what I hold? I think a court might have questions about what you hold and how you came to hold it. Something shifted in Mercer's expression. Small, but Clara, listening past the kitchen wall, caught it. Man talks big when he's running scared, Mercer said. Man talks plain when he's got the facts, Ethan said. Mercer looked past him into the house, like he was trying to see into the kitchen, like he suspected something. Your woman ought to be careful, he said pleasantly. Red Rock can be unkind to women without roots. Ethan moved slightly, just 1 step forward, but it changed the geometry of the doorway in a way that meant something. You ought to be careful, he said, equally pleasant, about what comes out of your mouth when you're standing on my porch. The smile on Mercer's face went somewhere colder. He left. Clara came out of the kitchen when the sound of hooves was gone. She stood beside Ethan at the door, and they both looked at the empty road. He knows, she said. Or suspects. He suspects, Ethan said. Knowing takes longer. We need to move faster than his suspicion. Ethan looked at her. We. She met his eyes, and didn't flinch. We, she said again. That night, Clara sat at the table late after Ethan had gone to bed. She opened her notebook, not the one she used for document analysis, but a smaller one, older, the cover worn soft. She didn't write anything, just held it, ran her thumb along the edge. She had come here because she had nowhere else to go. She had signed Galt's papers because a temporary situation with clear terms was still safer than the permanent situation she'd been escaping. She had expected a transaction. She had expected a man who would treat her like inventory he'd rented. She had not expected to be given a separate room. She had not expected coffee at the table without being asked. She had not expected a man who stepped forward in a doorway rather than stepping back, and who said, "Your wife is respectable," before he'd had any particular reason to believe it. She closed the notebook. Outside, the last of the storm had finally finished passing. The sky through the kitchen window was clearing one star at a time, like something slowly remembering what it was. Clara Whitmore put her hand flat on the table. She was not going to make the mistake of calling this safe, but she was very carefully, and with considerable caution, beginning to consider that it might become something. And in Red Rock in 1870, something in a house with a crooked porch rail and a cold creek running along the east fence that was a more dangerous thought than anything Silas Mercer had brought to their doorstep. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. And in the morning, there would be more work to do. The morning after Mercer's visit, Ethan found Clara already at the kitchen table before sunrise, with the document copy spread flat and her notebook open beside it. A second lamp pulled close because the early light wasn't enough. She hadn't slept much. He could tell by the way she held her shoulders, not tense exactly, but braced like a woman who had spent the night making decisions she wasn't going to announce. "You're up early," he said. "I've been thinking about the notary records," she said without looking up. The county would have kept a register. Every document Aldridge stamped in 1864 would appear in a sequential log with a corresponding entry number. If Mercer's deed carries an entry number, it should match the log. If it doesn't... She finally looked up. "We have a second proof that doesn't depend on my word alone." Ethan stood in the doorway. "The county register is in Cheyenne." "I know." "That's 3 days' ride." "I know that too." She held his gaze. "But right now, it's the cleanest evidence we have. My analysis of the document is expert testimony, but it's still one woman's opinion. A missing log entry is a fact. Facts are harder to argue against in front of a judge." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him like she was completely comfortable with him taking his time, like she'd already had this argument with herself at 2 a.m. and won. "All right," he said. "I'll ride to Cheyenne." "We'll ride to Cheyenne," she said. "Clara, don't." Her voice was quiet, but very firm. "Don't tell me to stay here and be safe. The document analysis is my work. If someone challenges the reading of the notary seal, I need to be present to explain it. You are not a bookkeeper. I am." She closed the notebook. "This is not bravery, Mr. Calloway. This is professional necessity." He stared at her. Then he said, "Can you ride?" "Tolerably," she said. "We leave Friday," he said. She turned back to her notes. "Thursday is better." He opened his mouth, then closed it. Thursday it was. But before Thursday came Wednesday, and Wednesday brought the kind of trouble that arrives quietly and does the most damage. Clara walked into town alone. She hadn't asked Ethan's permission, partly because she didn't think she needed it, and partly because she suspected he would try to come with her, and she wasn't ready for that yet. She needed to move through Red Rock on her own terms and understand what they were dealing with before she let anyone beside her while she did it. She needed flower lamp oil and a look at the faces of the people who had already decided who she was. Harmon's was quiet when she arrived. Tuesday's crowd of opinionated women had dispersed, and the store held only old Mr. Harmon behind the counter, and a young man in the corner examining bridal hardware with the focused attention of someone avoiding eye contact. She found her flour. She found her lamp oil. She was reaching for a paper of pins when the door opened behind her and brought in Silas Mercer, not alone. He had one of his men with him, the taller one from the porch visit, who had never spoken but had watched everything with the particular attentiveness of someone paid to remember details. Clara didn't turn around immediately. She took the pins from the shelf. She set them with her other items. She turned with the natural pace of a woman who had not been ambushed by anything. Mercer looked directly at her. "Mrs. Calloway," he said pleasantly, using the name like a test. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Settling in all right?" "Very well, thank you." He moved toward the counter, and because the store was small, and she was between him and it, this meant he was moving toward her. His man drifted to the side, casually, the way things drift when someone has placed them deliberately. "I knew a Whitmore family once," Mercer said, stopping at a distance that was 3 inches closer than polite. "Down El Paso way. Any relation?" "No," she said. "You sure woman comes all the way up from the border for a man she's never met?" He tilted his head. "Usually there's a story behind that kind of journey." "Most journeys have stories," she said. "Most of them aren't other people's business." "Friendly curiosity," he said. "Is it?" "A beat." His eyes moved across her face in the considering way of a man taking inventory of a problem. "Your husband's got himself an interesting theory about my land deed," he said, dropping the pleasant register a half step. Just enough. "I hope he hasn't involved you in that business." "My husband's business is my business," she said. "That's generally how marriage works." "For some women," he smiled. "The smart ones know when something isn't their fight." She looked at him. She held it. She said, "Good day, Mr. Mercer," picked up her basket and walked to the counter to pay. She could feel him watching her back the entire time. She counted the coins into Mr. Harmon's hand, and she kept her hand perfectly steady while she did it. Outside on the sidewalk, she walked half a block and then stopped and pressed her back against the wall of the barber shop and let out one long, slow breath. Her hands were shaking now. She looked down at them, steadied them deliberately. 1, 2, 3. She was not afraid of Silas Mercer. She had met worse men in smaller rooms with fewer exits. But she was afraid of what he represented, not the physical threat, but the institutional one. The man who had the town's belief, and the county's ear, and the judge's familiarity, and nothing but contempt for the fact that she had the truth. Truth needed leverage. She'd learned that in El Paso. A woman with the right answer and no standing was still a woman with nothing. She needed that register in Cheyenne. She pushed off the wall and walked back to where she'd hitched the wagon. Sitting on the driver's bench, waiting for her arms crossed, hat pulled low, was Ethan. She stopped. "I thought you had fence work," she said. "I finished early." "How long have you been waiting?" "Long enough to see Mercer come out of Harmon's," he said, "and long enough to see the way you were standing against that wall after." She climbed up onto the bench beside him. She didn't say anything right away. He didn't press. "He was warning me off," she said finally. "He wanted me to know that he's watching, and that the intelligent thing for me to do is convince you to drop it." "What did you say?" "I told him marriage means shared business." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Did you believe that when you said it?" She looked at him. The question surprised her, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was exactly the right one. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He picked up the reins. "That's fair," he said. They drove back to the ranch in the kind of silence that had started to feel less like absence and more like something being carefully constructed between two people who were both still learning its dimensions. That evening, Ethan did something Clara hadn't expected. He sat down at the table while she was working and he began to talk. Not about Mercer, not about the land. He talked about his father. "He came to Red Rock with $40 and a broken wagon wheel," Ethan said. He was looking at his hands, not her. "He fixed the wheel himself using someone else's tools, and that was the last time he borrowed anything from anyone. Built the first structure alone. Ran 300 head of cattle alone the first 2 years because he couldn't afford a hand." He paused. "He was not a warm man, but he was an honest one. And he told me once that a man who takes something that isn't his, no matter how clean the paper says it is still a thief. Just a thief with better filing." Clara set down her pen. "Mercer has better filing," she said quietly. "For now," Ethan said. She looked at him. The lamp between them was the only light, and it made his face look older and also somehow more open than she'd seen it. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because you asked me last week how long I'd had this ranch, and I told you the year. I didn't tell you what that number means." He was quiet for a moment. "I think you should know what you're fighting for." Something moved through Clara's chest that she had no clean name for. "I think I should know too," she said very quietly. He nodded once, got up, said goodnight, went to bed. Clara sat at the table alone for a long time after that. She pressed her hand flat against the wood. She thought, this is dangerous. Not Mercer, not the ride to Cheyenne, not the judge or the forged document or the town that had already made up its mind about her. This, right here. A man telling her what something is worth because he trusts her enough to say it out loud. That was the dangerous part. She opened her notebook and wrote 12 pages of the most precise document analysis she had ever produced in her life, because precision was something she knew how to trust when everything else felt uncertain. They left for Cheyenne on Thursday as planned. The road ran north, and the country opened up the way it did out past Red Rock, wider sky, longer sightlines, the kind of space that made a person feel either very free or very exposed, depending on what they were carrying. Clara rode adequately. Better than adequately, actually, though she had understated it. She had a quiet, natural balance that Ethan noticed on the first mile and stopped watching by the third because it was clear she didn't need monitoring. They made good time through the morning. Around midday, they stopped by a creek to water the horses, and Clara crouched at the bank and splashed water on her face with both hands in the practical way of someone not thinking about being watched. "You've done this kind of riding before," Ethan said. "El Paso to the border settlement twice a year for 3 years," she said. "Not for pleasure." "What for?" She was quiet for a moment. "Documents," she said finally. "My employer sent me with legal filings. He liked that I was quiet and fast and didn't attract attention." "A woman alone on that road," Ethan said. "Not an accusation, just the fact. A woman alone on most roads learns to become very good at not attracting attention," she said. She stood up and dried her face with the back of her wrist. "I wasn't always successful." The sentence sat there. Ethan didn't push. He had learned in the past 10 days that Clara Whitmore's silences were not empty. They were deliberate, and there was information in the shape of them if he paid attention. She had just told him something important without finishing the sentence, and he understood that the unfinished part was the part she hadn't decided whether to trust him with yet. "We should keep moving," he said. "Yes?" she agreed. They rode. By mid-afternoon, they were an hour out of a trading outpost called Cutter's Cross when Ethan noticed the rider. One man. Following at a distance that suggested he knew how far back he needed to stay to remain unremarkable. But he'd been there for 40 minutes staying parallel rather than closing, which meant he wasn't in a hurry. He was just watching where they went. "We have company," Ethan said quietly, not turning his head. Clara didn't turn either. "I saw him about 30 minutes ago," she said. He glanced at her. "You didn't say anything." "I was waiting to see if you'd notice." A beat. "Did I pass?" "Tolerably," she said, using his word from 3 days ago, and the slight shift in her voice was something he was beginning to recognize as the closest thing she had to a joke. "Mercer's man," Ethan said, almost certainly. She kept her eyes forward. "He's not here to hurt us on an open road in daylight. He's here to know where we're going. Which means Mercer will know about Cheyenne before we arrive. Which means we need to be faster in Cheyenne than we planned." She paused. "And we need to find the register before someone else gets the opportunity to lose it." The word "lose" sat between them with full understanding of what it meant. They picked up pace. The rider behind them picked up pace. Clara said, "If we cut east at the Cutter's Cross Fork instead of continuing north, we add 40 minutes to the ride, but we'll pass through Morrison Settlement. Open land, open sightlines. He can still follow, but he'll have fewer options for anything other than following." "You've studied the road," Ethan said. "I studied your maps the night before we left," she said simply. He looked at her. When? After you went to bed. He stared at the road ahead for a moment. East Fork, he said. East Fork, she agreed. They rode east. The man behind them hesitated at the fork for a full 30 seconds. Ethan counted without looking, and then followed. They made Morrison's settlement by late afternoon, and the open country did exactly what Clara had predicted. The follower kept his distance, and his options narrowed to nothing useful, and by the time they reached the outpost's single boarding house, he had dropped back far enough to be invisible. Which meant he knew they'd made him. Which meant Mercer would know by tomorrow that they had not only identified his man, but rerouted deliberately. That night in the boarding house, 2 rooms. Clara's door directly across the narrow hall from Ethan's. Clara sat on the edge of her bed and listened to the quiet of an unfamiliar building the way she had learned to listen to all unfamiliar spaces. She catalogued sounds. The creak of a board in the hall. The distant talk of men at the outpost's small bar. The wind. A knock at her door. Light. 3 knocks. Ethan's knock. She'd already learned the rhythm. "Come in," she said. He opened the door and stayed in the doorway. He had something in his hand, a folded paper. "I wrote out what I need from the county register," he said. "The specific entry numbers that should correspond to the 1864 period. I want you to check my list against your own in case I missed something." She held out her hand. He crossed the room and gave her the paper, and she unfolded it and read it and pulled her own notebook from her satchel and compared the 2 lists. "You're missing the subledger reference codes," she said. The register would have had both the primary log and a corresponding subledger for large parcels over 100 acres. "We need both." "Can you write those in?" She did, handed it back. He looked at her additions, nodded. "Thank you," he said. He moved to leave and then stopped. He turned back and said in a different voice, lower, less official, "Are you all right?" She looked up from her notebook. "I'm fine," she said. "That's not what I asked," he said. "I asked if you're all right." The distinction was precise, and she knew it. She held her pen and was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "I'm not used to being asked." The words came out more honest than she'd intended. She saw him absorb that, watched him not look away from it. "I know," he said. "Neither am I." He said goodnight and left. Clara sat very still for a long moment. Then she pressed her back against the headboard and stared at the ceiling and thought about the document analysis and the register codes and what Judge Aldridge's subledger entry would look like if it existed, and whether the binding would match the period, and how much time they would have once they arrived in Cheyenne before Mercer's knowledge of their location became a problem. She thought about all of those things, and underneath all of them, like the cold creek running along the east fence back at the ranch, she thought about the way he'd said, "That's not what I asked," and hadn't flinched at her answer. She pulled her blanket up. In the morning, there was a second rider outside the boarding house. Ethan saw him first when he stepped out before Clara was awake. Different horse, different man, but the same deliberate stillness of someone positioned rather than traveling. He went back inside and knocked on Clara's door. "2 of them now," he said through the door. A brief pause. Then her door opened, and she stood there, already dressed, already thinking. "He sent a second one overnight," she said. "Yes. He's not just watching anymore," she said. "He's creating pressure. He wants us to know he knows, which means he wants us to feel watched enough to turn back." She looked at Ethan directly. "We don't turn back." "No," he said. "We don't." They rode to Cheyenne with 2 men behind them. The county records office opened at 8 in the morning, and Clara was at the door at 7:55. The clerk was a small, precise man named Wills, who wore the expression of someone who took the integrity of his filing system very personally, which Clara decided immediately was the best possible thing. She asked for the 1864 notarial log. She asked with the exact language of a professional who had asked for similar documents many times using the official register terminology and citing the subledger code with the kind of accuracy that makes bureaucrats settle into cooperation. Wills brought the register in 11 minutes. Clara opened it at the table with Ethan standing beside her. She ran her finger down the entries for the June to September period of 1864. Land transactions, sales, confirmations of ownership. Aldridge's stamps, each one recorded with its entry number and corresponding plot description. She found the entry number that appeared on Mercer's deed. She read the description beside it. She went very still. "What is it?" Ethan said quietly. "The entry number on Mercer's deed corresponds to a real transaction from 1864, she said. She kept her voice low. "But the plot description in the register is for a different parcel entirely. 40 acres near the river settlement. Not your land." She looked up at him. "He didn't fabricate an entry," she said. "He stole a real one. Took an existing entry number from a legitimate 1864 transaction and copied the notary stamp and number onto a forged deed for your parcel. He was counting on no one going back to the source register to compare descriptions." Ethan stared at the page. "He nearly got away with it," he said. "He would have," Clara said. "Against most people he would have." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Can Wills certify a copy of this page?" Ethan said. "That's exactly what I'm going to ask him," Clara said. She stood up, smoothed her jacket, and went to find Mr. Wills, with the particular purposeful stride of a woman who had just found exactly what she came for and was not going to let anyone take it from her before she had it in certified writing. Wills made the copy. He stamped it. He signed his name to the certification with the careful hand of a man who understood that he was in this moment participating in something that mattered. Clara folded the certified copy and placed it inside her notebook, and placed the notebook inside her satchel against her body. When they walked out of the county records office, both of Mercer's riders were across the street, watching. Ethan's hand moved slightly, toward the side of his coat, where Clara knew he carried. She touched his arm once lightly without looking at him. "Not here," she said quietly. "Not now. This is what he wants, a reason that isn't legal." "I know," he said. But he was still looking at the two men. "Ethan." She said his name for the first time. No mister, just his name, low and direct, and it seemed to catch him somewhere he wasn't expecting. He looked at her. "We have what we came for. Let's go home." A pause. He settled. "All right," he said. They walked to the horses. The riders didn't follow. They stayed where they were and watched, which was worse in a different way, because it meant they already had what they needed. The knowledge that Clara and Ethan had the register evidence, and they were letting them leave, because Mercer had already decided what the next move would be. Clara felt it. The particular cold certainty of a trap she could see the shape of, but not yet the trigger. She rode out of Cheyenne with the notebook against her ribs and the certified copy inside it, and the feeling of something closing in from a direction she hadn't yet identified. Behind her, Red Rock was waiting. And so was whatever Silas Mercer had spent the past 2 days arranging in their absence. She kept her pace steady, her face forward. And she began quietly and with great care to think 3 steps ahead. They rode back into Red Rock on a Saturday afternoon, and the town felt different. Clara noticed it before she could name it. The way people on the sidewalk tracked them without turning their heads all the way. The way conversation at the front of the feed store stopped at the wrong moment. The way Sheriff Holt was standing outside his office, not leaning, not casual, but positioned, which was a different thing entirely. "Something happened while we were gone," she said quietly. "I see it," Ethan said. They took the horses to the livery, and Ethan handed the reins to the stable boy without looking away from the street. Clara kept the satchel close against her side, the notebook inside it, the certified copy inside the notebook. She had not let it out of contact with her body since Cheyenne. The stable boy, 12 years old, gap-toothed, usually talkative, said nothing. "Son," Ethan said, "what's going on in town?" The boy glanced toward the street, then back. He lowered his voice. "Mr. Mercer's been talking to people, sir, since Thursday. Talking to a lot of people." "What kind of talking?" "The kind where you end up agreeing with him," the boy said. "My pa says—" He stopped. looked at Clara. "My pa says there's talk about the woman, about where she came from, what she did before." Clara kept her face entirely still. "What did she do before?" Ethan asked, and his voice had gone to a register that was very quiet and very careful. "I don't know exactly," the boy said. "Just that Mercer's saying she ain't what she told you she was, and that a court wouldn't take the word of a woman like that." Ethan thanked him and gave him a coin, and they walked out of the livery into the afternoon light. "He knew," Clara said. "He knew what we went to find." "His riders telegraphed ahead," Ethan said. "He had 2 days. 2 days to find something about my past he could use." She said it without emotion, the way you say something you've been expecting and still don't like hearing. "He didn't need it to be true. He just needed it to be talked about before we got back." Ethan stopped walking. Clara stopped beside him. "Is there something he could have found?" he asked, not accusatory, just direct and careful. She turned to look at him fully. "In El Paso, I worked for a man named Caldwell. He ran a land brokerage that was not entirely legal. I kept his books because I needed the work and I was good at it, and I told myself that bookkeeping wasn't the same as approving of what he did." She paused. "When the federal investigator came, Caldwell told him I was the one who designed the filing system," which was true. He did not tell him that he had designed the scheme itself, which was also true. "I was cleared after 6 weeks, but the investigation is a matter of record." She held his gaze the entire time she spoke. Ethan was quiet. "So there's a federal investigation on record with your name in it," he said. "Yes." "And Mercer found it." "He would have found it within a day if he knew where to look. And he clearly knew where to look." "Does it change what you found in Cheyenne?" Ethan said. "No," she said. "The certified copy is exactly what it is regardless of who found it." "Then it doesn't change anything," he said. She stared at him. "It changes how a court sees my testimony." "Then we make sure the certified copy does the work, and your testimony supports it instead of the other way around." He started walking again. "A document certified by a county clerk doesn't need your reputation to be true." She stood still for one moment watching him walk, and something moved in her chest that she refused to examine at full strength because they were standing in the middle of Red Rock's main street and she needed all of her faculties. She caught up with him. "You're not—" She stopped. "What? You're not going to ask me anything else about El Paso?" "Not unless you want to tell me," he said. "You told me what's relevant. The rest is yours." She didn't say anything for half a block. Then quietly, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "Just keep that notebook safe." They went to the ranch. By Sunday morning, the threats had changed shape. The first thing was the fence on the north boundary. Cut. Not broken by weather or livestock, cut cleanly with a tool in 3 places, which meant the cattle that had been grazing in the north field had wandered into the creek drainage, and 2 had to be brought back by hand before noon. Ethan came in with mud on his boots and a particular flatness in his expression that Clara had learned was more dangerous than anger. "Deliberate," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'll ride the perimeter." "I'm coming with you." "Clara, don't," she said, already pulling on her coat. "You just told me yesterday that what I know matters. What I know includes the fact that sending you out alone right now is exactly what Mercer wants. He wants you separated and reacting. I'm not going to help him do that." He looked at her. "Get your horse," he said. They rode the full perimeter together. The fence had been cut in 3 places on the north and 1 place on the east cut positioned near the creek, near the low bank, where a person on foot could cross and be on Callaway land without coming through the gate. Clara dismounted at the east cut and crouched to look at it. "Someone stood here," she said. She was looking at the ground. For a while. The grass is pressed in a standing pattern, not a walking one. Ethan crouched beside her. "Watching the house." "Watching the house," she confirmed. This wasn't just fence damage. Someone wanted to see the layout, where we sleep, where the lamp burns last at night. She said it plainly and felt the weight of it plainly, and stood up and brushed her hands on her trousers and looked at Ethan and saw that he was not looking at the fence anymore. He was looking at her face. "We need to sleep with the door barred," she said. "Yes, and you need to tell me where the rifle is kept." A beat. "I'll show you tonight," he said. They rode back toward the house, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that Mercer was no longer being careful about being indirect. The second thing happened Monday. Clara was in town alone. They had agreed she would handle the errand while Ethan repaired the cut fence, and they had agreed she would be fast when she came out of the post office and found two of Mercer's men standing at her horse, not touching it, just standing there. She walked up as though she had not noticed anything unusual, placed her letters in her satchel, untied her horse, and put her foot in the stirrup. One of the men put his hand on the bridle. "Mr. Mercer would like a word," he said. "Mr. Mercer can write me a letter," she said. She swung up into the saddle with the clean, practiced motion of a woman who had learned that hesitation in these moments was the most dangerous thing. The man held the bridle for one more second, just long enough to make his point, and then let go. She rode without hurrying. Her heart was hitting her ribs like a fist. She had 2 blocks of Red Rock's main street to cross before she was out of the built area, and she used every foot of it to breathe carefully and keep her back straight and her pace even, because the only currency available to her in that moment was the appearance of a woman who was not afraid. She was afraid. She had been afraid before, and she knew how to work inside it. But she also knew that Mercer had just crossed a line. Sending men to physically intercept her in public was not warning anymore. It was demonstration. He was showing her and anyone watching that he could reach her wherever she was. She got back to the ranch and Ethan was at the fence, and she said, "Mercer's men stopped me outside the post office." And before she finished the sentence, he had dropped the wire tool and was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger exactly, but something beneath anger. Something older and quieter and considerably more dangerous. "Did they touch you?" he said. Not a question, a temperature check. "One held my horse's bridle," she said. Nothing more. The muscle at the side of his jaw moved. "Ethan." She kept her voice level. "I need you to stay here. Clara." Going into town right now and finding those men is what he wants. He wants you to do something that hands him a legal justification for involving the sheriff. Do not give it to him. She was standing directly in front of him, and she held his eyes, the way you hold something you're not letting go. "Do you hear me?" A long pause. "I hear you," he said. Through his teeth, but he said it. "Good." She let out a breath. "Now help me finish the fence, and then we need to talk about the timeline for presenting the evidence to the county court, because Mercer is accelerating, and we need to move before he decides to stop being subtle." He picked up the wire tool. She worked beside him. That was Monday. Tuesday brought the worst of it. Clara was at the creek in the early morning, the one habit she'd allowed herself since arriving 10 minutes alone at the water before the day began, when she heard footsteps behind her that were too deliberate to be Ethan. She turned. It was a man she didn't know. Not one of Mercer's regular 2. Older, trail-worn, with the flat eyes of someone who had been paid to deliver a message and had stopped thinking about the content of messages a long time ago. "Mr. Mercer says you have something that belongs to him," the man said. "Mr. Mercer is mistaken," Clara said. "Says you took a document from the county office in Cheyenne." "I requested a certified copy of a public record," she said, "which is a legal action available to any citizen. He'd like it returned." It was never his. The man took one step closer. Clara didn't step back. She put her feet squarely beneath her and kept her hands visible and her chin level and looked at him with the specific expression she had developed over years of being a woman alone in rooms with men who thought her presence there was an invitation to define the terms. "I'd advise you to step back," she said. "We are 30 feet from a house where there is a rifle, and the man who owns that rifle is considerably more motivated than you are." The man stopped. He looked at her for a moment with something close to professional assessment. "You've got sand, lady," he said. I'll tell him that. You can tell him whatever you like, she said. But tell him this also: the certified copy has already been replicated, and those copies are in locations he won't find them. Coming after the original now accomplishes nothing except showing a court how desperate he is. This was a partial bluff. She had made one copy, given it to the county court's filing office under a submission for review, but she hadn't distributed it as broadly as she'd implied. She said it anyway with full conviction, because conviction was the thing. The man held her gaze for another 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked back through the creek grass and was gone. Clara stood at the water for another moment. Then she went inside. Ethan was in the kitchen. He took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him. He was quiet through the whole account. When she finished, he stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her. And she watched the line of his shoulders and the particular way he was holding himself. Not loose, not relaxed, but deliberate. The way you hold yourself when you are deciding between two things, and one of them is going to cost you something. He sent someone to the creek, Ethan said. That's the property line. That's intentional. He turned. He knows our routine. He knows when you go out alone. Yes. That means he has someone watching close, not the riders from the road. Someone on foot close enough to observe the house. I know. She paused. I already looked at the east fence line this morning before I went to the creek. The grass was pressed again. Same pattern as before. He stared at her. You didn't wake me. I needed to see it myself first. Clara. His voice was very controlled. If you'd found someone at that fence line instead of just the evidence of someone, then I would have woken you, she said. But I didn't, and I needed the information before I could make a decision about what it meant. It's not... He stopped, started again. You don't have to do everything alone. The sentence landed in an unexpected place. She looked at him carefully. I know, she said. And then because it was true, I'm still learning that. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face did what it occasionally did that brief opening, the one he usually closed quickly, but this time he let it stay a beat longer. All right, he said. What do? We go to Judge Carver today, she said. Not tomorrow. Today. We file for an emergency review of the deed challenge on the basis of the certified register evidence. We do it before Mercer can get to Carver first, because you can be certain he's already planning to. Carver's not our friend, Ethan said. He hunts with Mercer's crowd. I know, Clara said. Which is why I've also written a letter to the federal land office in Denver, requesting oversight of the county court proceedings on the basis of potential misconduct. I wrote it in Cheyenne and mailed it from there, which means it's already in transit. She held his gaze. I needed a second route that doesn't depend on Carver. He stared at her. You mailed a federal letter from Cheyenne without telling me, he said. I was going to tell you when we had a moment that wasn't about riding or fence lines or men standing at my horse. She paused. This is the moment. He opened his mouth, closed it. How long until the federal office responds? He said. 2 weeks minimum. Could be 4. She looked at him steadily. We need Carver to give us enough delay to make it to that response. We don't need him to rule in our favor. We just need him to not rule against us before Denver weighs in. That's a tight margin, he said. Yes, she said. So we leave for Carver's office in an hour. Judge Carver had a face built for skepticism, and an office that smelled like old paper and tobacco, and the particular staleness of a man who had made his decisions too long ago to revisit them comfortably. He received them without warmth, and looked at the certified copy the way a man looks at something he's been told to find fault with. He looked at it for a long time. This is a county clerk's certification, he said. From the Cheyenne Records Office, Clara said, signed and stamped by Clerk Wills. The certification confirms that entry number 4471 in the 1864 notarial log corresponds to a parcel description that does not match the property described in Mr. Mercer's deed. The same entry number appears on both documents. They cannot both be authentic. Carver looked at her over the top of the paper. And you are Clara Calloway, she said, steadily. Formerly employed as a bookkeeper in land brokerage. I have direct professional experience reading notarial records and property filings. I'm aware of your employment history, Carver said. The room went very still. I was cleared by federal investigators, she said. Completely and in writing. I can produce that documentation if the court requires it. It may require it, he said. Then we will produce it, she said. She did not look at Ethan. She did not need to. She could feel him beside her, and that was enough. In the meantime, the certified copy is before you, and the question of the entry number discrepancy is factual and verifiable by any party the court appoints. We are asking for a stay of any ownership transfer pending review. Carver set the paper down. He looked at Ethan. You understand that Mr. Mercer's legal standing is substantial. So is mine, Ethan said. I was born on that land. Birth doesn't create title, Carver said. No, Ethan said. But 40 years of continuous documented ownership does, and the document trying to remove that ownership has a fraudulent entry number, which my wife just showed you. The word wife sat in the room with quiet weight. Carver looked between them. I'll review the certified copy, he said finally. I'll make no determination today. We're not asking for a determination today, Clara said. We're asking for a stay. You'll have my response by Friday, he said. It was not a yes, but it wasn't a no. They walked out of the courthouse and stood in the afternoon light, and Clara let out a breath that had been compressed in her chest for the past hour. Friday, Ethan said. Friday, she said, which gives Mercer 4 days to work on Carver. And gives us 4 days to make sure Carver's decision gets harder to compromise. I have an idea about that, she said. He looked at her. The witnesses, she said. You told me there were 2 witnesses to your father's 1865 ownership confirmation. 2 dead, one in Colorado. Holt Ferris moved to Denver. Denver, she said, and let the word mean what it meant. Ethan went very still. We already have a letter at the federal office in Denver. Yes, she said. And if Holt Ferris is still alive and is willing to provide a signed statement, that's a live witness to the original legitimate ownership confirmation. Combined with the certified register copy and the federal oversight inquiry, she said, we stop being one woman's analysis. We become a case. He looked at her for a long moment in the afternoon light of the Red Rock courthouse steps, and there was something in his expression that she was no longer able to categorize under any professional heading. It was not gratitude exactly. It was the look of a man who had been carrying something alone for a very long time, and had just in this moment noticed that someone was carrying it beside him. I'll wire Denver tonight, he said. I already drafted the telegram, she said. It's in the notebook. He stared at her. And then, for the first time since she had arrived in Red Rock soaking wet and hatless in a muddy street, Ethan Calloway laughed. Not a big laugh, not warm and easy, but real. A short, startled sound that came from somewhere genuine and surprised him as much as it surprised her. Of course it is, he said. She felt something in her face move. Not a full smile, but the closest she had come in longer than she could accurately remember. They walked back toward the horses. They had 4 days. And from somewhere behind them, she was almost certain she could feel Mercer's attention on her back like a hand that hadn't touched her yet. She was almost certain that was about to change. She kept walking. Head up. Notebook pressed against her ribs. Whatever came next, she would not be standing still when it arrived. Carver's response came Thursday, not Friday. Thursday, which was 1 day early, and in Clara's experience, judges who ruled 1 day early were judges who had been told to. The letter arrived at the ranch by courier, a boy on a fast horse, who didn't wait for a reply. Ethan took the envelope and brought it inside and set it on the table without opening it, and looked at Clara. She picked it up and opened it and read it. She set it down. He denied the stay, she said. Ethan was very still. On what grounds? Insufficient evidence of fraud. She kept her voice flat and informational because that was the only way she was going to get through the next 10 minutes without letting the thing in her chest become something unmanageable. He acknowledges the certified copy, but rules that entry number discrepancies may result from clerical error rather than deliberate falsification. He has scheduled a final ownership hearing for next Wednesday. 1 week. 1 week. Ethan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and put both hands flat on the table and stared at them. Clerical error, he said. That's what he wrote. A clerical error that happens to transfer 300 acres to Silas Mercer. Yes. A silence that was tight and full. He got to Carver, Ethan said. Almost certainly before we did, Clara said. The question is whether it matters. She pulled the notebook toward her. The federal letter is in transit. Holt Ferris, did you get a reply to the telegram? Not yet. When did you send it? Monday night. Then we may have a reply by tomorrow or Saturday. She was already writing. If Ferris is alive and willing, a signed statement from a living witness to your father's 1865 confirmation changes the weight of the case, even if Carver won't acknowledge it. We present it at the Wednesday hearing, and we make Carver put his refusal on the public record in front of witnesses. And if Ferris doesn't reply, she looked up. Then we walk into that hearing with what we have, and we make it as loud and as documented as possible. Because the federal office in Denver will eventually respond, and when they do, everything that happened in that courtroom will be on record. She paused. Mercer wins the battle on Wednesday. We need to make sure he doesn't win the war in the documentation. Ethan looked at her across the table. You've been thinking about this since Monday. I've been thinking about this since the moment I read the Cheyenne Register and understood what he'd done, she said. I knew Carver was a risk. I planned for Carver saying no. And if Denver doesn't respond in time, she was quiet for 1 beat. 2. Then we think of something else, she said. But we don't get to that problem yet. We're still on this one. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. All right, he said. What do you need from me? I need you to go to town today and talk to people. Not about Mercer, not about the hearing. Just talk, be seen, be calm. Because right now Mercer is winning the narrative, and the only counter to that is you not looking like a man who's losing. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it. You want me to perform confidence. I want you to remember that you have it, she said. And let people see that. He stood up, settled his hat, looked at her one more time. Don't go to the creek alone today, he said. I know, she said. He left. Clara sat at the table alone and opened the notebook to a fresh page and began to write the most precise and devastating legal summary of the entry number discrepancy that she was capable of producing. Because if they were walking into Carver's courtroom on Wednesday, she was going to walk in with a document that could not be ignored without deliberate choice, and she was going to make sure that deliberate choice was visible to everyone in that room. She wrote for 4 hours without stopping. Friday's telegram reply changed everything. Ethan brought it in from town at mid-morning, and he didn't say anything when he handed it to her. Just put it on the table beside her notebook and waited. She read it. She read it again. Holt Ferris is alive, she said. He's 71 years old and living in a boarding house in Denver, and he says... She stopped. Her voice had done something she hadn't entirely authorized. She steadied it. He says he has been waiting 12 years for someone to ask him about that 1865 confirmation. He says your father's ownership was airtight, and he says Silas Mercer tried to buy that land from your father in 1863, and your father refused him. Ethan sat down. Tried to buy it, he said slowly, and was refused. Clara looked at him. That's motive. That's documented personal motive going back 17 years. This isn't opportunistic land fraud. This is a grudge. She was already calculating. If Ferris will provide a written statement... He says he'll come, Ethan said. She stopped. Read the second paragraph, he said. She looked back at the telegram. Holt Ferris was not offering a written statement. Holt Ferris was offering to come to Red Rock in person and testify in open court. He could be there by Tuesday. Clara set the telegram down very carefully. 1 day before the hearing, she said. Yes, that's... She stopped, looked at Ethan. That's enough. A live witness with direct knowledge of the original transaction and evidence of prior motive. Combined with a certified register copy and the federal oversight letter, Carver can still rule against us. But it will be the most expensive ruling of his career if Denver is watching. Will Denver be watching by Wednesday? I don't know, she said honestly. But I'm going to write to the local land office today and inform them directly of the Wednesday hearing date and request that a federal observer be present. I'll cite the existing Denver letter as precedent. She paused. They may say no, but they also may not. Ethan leaned back in his chair. You know what the difference between you and every lawyer I've ever spoken to is? She looked at him. They tell me what can't be done, he said. You tell me what we haven't tried yet. She held his gaze for a moment. There's always something we haven't tried yet, she said quietly. Until there isn't. It was not a reassurance. It was a fact. He understood it as one. Saturday night, the barn burned. Not the house, not the fields. The barn, specifically the one structure that could be destroyed without criminal charges, but would cost Ethan the stored winter feed, 2 months of supply, and the shelter for 4 horses in the coming cold. They smelled it from the house. Ethan was out the door before Clara had fully woken. She came out 30 seconds behind him, and they fought it together. Buckets from the water trough. The horses already panicking. Ethan going in twice for equipment before she grabbed his arm and pulled him back because the roof beam was cracking, and going in a third time would have killed him. He let her pull him. She hadn't been certain he would. They stood in the yard and watched it finish, and the night smelled like ash and ruined feed and something older than that. Something that made Clara's throat close for a reason that wasn't smoke. He's done waiting, Ethan said. Yes, she said. This is him telling me he'll burn the house next if I go to that courtroom Wednesday. That's what this is meant to tell you, Clara said. It doesn't mean he will. It means he's hoping you'll believe he will. Ethan turned to look at her. He was covered in ash, and his left forearm had a burn along it from the second time he'd gone in, not serious, but visible, and his face in the dark held something she hadn't seen there before. Not defeat, but the edge of something very close to it. Clara, he said. That's our winter feed. I know. We can't... He stopped. If he burns the house, he won't burn the house, she said. Not before Wednesday. Burning a barn is a warning. Burning a house is a crime that brings federal attention he doesn't want when he's already being looked at by Denver. She stepped closer to him, not touching him, just closer. He is trying to make you make a mistake. He wants you angry enough to do something that hands him the legal advantage. She held his eyes. Don't give it to him. He looked at her for a long moment. I am angry, he said. I know you are, she said. So am I. He looked down at the burn on his forearm, back up at her. Tell me something we can do, he said. Not something we can't. Tell me something we can do. Tomorrow morning, you go to Sheriff Holt, and you report the fire as deliberate property destruction, and you do it with 3 neighbors as witnesses, so it goes into the public record. You don't accuse Mercer by name. You describe the evidence of deliberate origin, and let Holt write down whatever he writes down. She paused. And Monday, I'm going to request that our summary brief and the certified copy and Ferris's incoming testimony be officially submitted to the court record before the hearing, so that even if Carver tries to limit what's presented Wednesday, it's already there. Can you do that? A party to a legal proceeding can submit documents to the public court record, she said. Yes, I can do that. Ethan stared at the ash. All right, he said finally. They went inside. Clara cleaned and wrapped the burn on his forearm at the kitchen table. Neither of them speaking, and she was aware with a kind of quiet clarity that this was a different kind of silence than the ones they'd shared before. Not the careful silence of 2 people learning each other. Not the working silence of a shared task. This was the silence of 2 people who had come through something together and were sitting in the aftermath of it and didn't need words for that. She tied the bandage. He looked at her hands on his arm for a moment. Thank you, he said, You pulled me out of the path of that roan horse on the day I arrived, she said. Consider us even. He looked at her. I didn't pull you out of anything. You stopped that horse yourself. You were going to, she said. He almost smiled. Almost. Sunday went the way she'd planned. Monday went harder. Clara arrived at the courthouse Monday morning to submit the documents to the public record, and the clerk, a young man she hadn't seen before, standing where the regular clerk usually stood, told her the submission window was closed, pending the Wednesday hearing. She asked for that in writing. He told her he didn't have authority to put it in writing. She asked for his supervisor. He told her his supervisor was unavailable. She looked at this young man. He was perhaps 22, uncomfortable, clearly given instructions he hadn't originated, and she said very calmly, "Please write down your name for me." He blinked. "Ma'am." "Your name," she said. "I want to record who refused submission of public documents and when, for my own documentation." He wrote his name. His hand shook slightly. She thanked him and left. Outside, she walked 2 doors down to the telegraph office and sent a telegram to the Federal Land Office in Denver, citing the specific obstruction by name date and clerk referencing her original letter and requesting urgent confirmation of the Federal Observer for Wednesday. Then she walked to the general store, bought a pound of coffee, and rode back to the ranch because she had a brief to finish, and she was not going to let the morning's obstruction mean the afternoon was wasted. Ethan read the telegram receipt when she got home. "You escalated to Denver," he said. "The obstruction is now on federal record," she said. "If they were ignoring us before, they have a harder time ignoring a documented pattern." "Did it work?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Make coffee while I write." He made coffee while she wrote. Holt Ferris arrived Tuesday afternoon on the 2 o'clock stage, 71 years old, and moving with the careful deliberateness of a man whose body had opinions about long journeys, but whose face said he'd made this trip because something had required him to. He was smaller than Ethan had described, slight white-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades not saying the thing he knew. He looked at Ethan when he stepped off the stage, and something moved across his face. "You look exactly like your father," Ferris said. "Exactly." Ethan shook his hand. "Thank you for coming, sir. I should have come years ago," Ferris said, and the weight of that was not self-pity, but accountability, and it landed differently. He looked at Clara. "You're the wife." "Clara Calloway," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Galt told me a woman put together the register evidence." She blinked. "You know Galt." "Galt's my nephew," Ferris said mildly. He mentioned the woman he'd placed with Calloway had a particular talent for documents. He paused. He didn't know what she'd find. I didn't either. But I came because Ethan's father deserved better than what Mercer did. And I am one of 3 men who knew the truth of that land, and I'm the last one standing. Clara looked at Ethan. He looked at her. "Mr. Ferris," she said, "I need to prepare you for what tomorrow will look like." She took him inside and sat him at the kitchen table and told him everything. The certified copy, the entry number, the forged deed, Carver's denied stay, the burned barn, the federal letters, what Wednesday would require of him, and how Mercer's lawyer would likely come at his testimony. Ferris listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You've done more in 6 weeks than the county did in 12 years. "We haven't done enough yet," she said. "No," he agreed, "but we will tomorrow." Tuesday night, Clara could not sleep. She lay in the small room with the crooked window and the notebook on the table beside her, and she stared at the dark and thought about every variable and every risk and every piece of documentation and whether it was enough and whether she'd missed something and what Mercer's lawyer would argue and how Carver would find a way to discount Ferris's testimony and whether Denver would come through or whether this all ended Wednesday with Ethan losing everything his father had built and her walking away with nothing accomplished and the terrible knowledge that she had tried. She thought about all of that, and then underneath it, she thought about what Ethan had said in the courthouse yard. "Tell me something we can do. Not tell me it will work. Not tell me we'll win. Tell me something we can do. She got up at 3 in the morning and lit the lamp and wrote for 2 more hours. And when she was done, she had the clearest, most economical legal brief she had ever produced in her life, organized in the exact sequence that gave Ferris's testimony its maximum weight in relation to the certified evidence structured, so that Carver's only route to dismissal was one that would be publicly indefensible. She didn't know if it was enough. She knew it was everything she had. Wednesday morning, they rode into Red Rock together, Ethan, Clara Holt Ferris, and the town watched them from sidewalks and doorways and windows with the particular attention of people who had already picked their side and were now waiting to see if they'd picked correctly. The courtroom was full. Mercer was there with 2 lawyers and a composed expression and the studied ease of a man who had decided the outcome in advance. His men lined the back wall. The regular townsfolk filled the middle. Sheriff Holt sat to the side with his hands on his belt and his face carefully neutral. Carver called the hearing to order. Mercer's lead lawyer, a man named Pryor, who had traveled from Santa Fe and whose suit cost more than Ethan's monthly expenses, presented the deed and the chain of title with the fluency of someone who had made identical arguments many times before and expected identical results. Then Clara stood. She had not been asked to present. She stood anyway, and Carver looked at her with the expression of a man about to tell her to sit down. "Your Honor," she said before he could speak. "As a party to this proceeding and a professional with documented expertise in land records and notarial documentation, I am submitting our brief and evidence packet into the court record under Territorial Rule 47, which permits parties to submit documentary evidence at any point before a final ruling." She placed the packet on the clerk's desk. "This includes the certified copy of the 1864 Cheyenne Notarial Register, a professional analysis of the entry number discrepancy, and a signed statement from Mr. Holt Ferris, a living witness to the 1865 continuous ownership confirmation of Callaway land." Pryor was on his feet. "Your Honor, this woman has no standing to—" "She is a party to this proceeding," Ethan said, standing beside her. "As my wife, her standing is identical to mine." Carver held up a hand. The room held its breath. Carver looked at the packet, at Clara, at Ferris, who was sitting in the witness area with his hands folded and his expression completely composed. "I'll review the submission," Carver said. "Your Honor," Pryor said sharply, "the deed is—" "I said I'll review it," Carver said, and something in his voice had shifted in a way that Pryor clearly hadn't expected. Clara sat down. Under the table, she felt Ethan's hand find hers and press once briefly and let go. She kept her face forward. She kept her breathing even. And at the back of the courtroom, a door opened. A man came in who was not from Red Rock. He wore a federal insignia on his coat, and he carried a leather document case, and he looked at the room with the professional dispassion of a man who had been sent somewhere official and intended to behave officially. The Federal Observer from Denver. Clara stared at him. She had not been certain he would come. She had written for him as though he would come. And there he was. Mercer saw him. She watched. Mercer see him watch the composed expression fracture at the edges. Just slightly. Just for a moment, before the controlled man reassembled it. But she had seen it. And she knew in that precise moment that the battle in this courtroom was no longer between Silas Mercer and Ethan Callaway. It was between a man who had believed he had already won and the reality that he had not. Carver called a 30-minute recess. In the hallway, Ethan looked at Clara and said, "You did that." "We did that," she said. "Clara, Ethan." She looked at him directly, and her voice held something she usually kept very carefully contained. "Your father built something worth fighting for. You kept fighting for it when you had no reason to believe you'd win. All I did was find the right tools." She held his gaze. "Don't give me what belongs to both of us." He looked at her for a long moment. In the crowded courthouse hallway with Red Rock watching, and Mercer 20 feet away, and the Federal Observer reviewing documents, and Holt Ferris sitting quietly on a bench with the patience of a man who had waited 12 years and could wait 30 more minutes. Ethan Callaway looked at Clara, Whitmore, at the woman who had arrived, soaking wet and hatless, and had stood in front of a runaway horse, and had sat at a kitchen table at 3 in the morning, and had built a case from nothing but precision and refusal. And he said, "What do I do if we win?" She understood the question. It wasn't about the land. She said, "You stop planning for 6 months." He went very still. She held his eyes. "If that's something you want," she said, carefully, honestly, leaving it entirely open. A beat. "Is it something you want?" he said. She thought about the creak and the crooked porch rail, and the coffee at the table, and the way he'd said, "That's not what I asked," and the burned barn, and 3 in the morning, and "Tell me something we can do." "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm considering it seriously." He nodded. Just once. "That's fair," he said. The same words he'd used the first day on the bench of the wagon, and she heard the echo of them and knew that he heard it too. The courthouse bell rang the end of recess. They walked back in together, and whatever came next, they walked into it side by side. Carver took 45 minutes instead of 30. Nobody in the courtroom moved much during those 45 minutes. Mercer's lawyers conferred in low voices at their table. Pryor kept looking at the Federal Observer the way a man looks at something he hadn't planned for and hasn't yet decided how to handle. The Observer sat in the back row with his document case on his knees and his expression giving nothing away, which Clara understood was itself a kind of pressure. The pressure of being watched by someone whose watching had institutional weight. Holt Ferris sat in the witness area with his hands folded and his eyes closed, and Clara couldn't tell if he was praying or simply resting, and decided it didn't matter because the effect was the same. Ethan sat beside her and didn't fidget. She had noticed early that he was not a man who fidgeted under pressure. He went still instead, the way deep water goes still, not because nothing is happening beneath it, but because what's happening is too serious for surface movement. She went over the brief in her head one more time. Every entry number, every subledger reference, every line of Ferris's signed statement. She had written it all, and she knew it the way she knew her own handwriting. But she went over it again anyway, because precision was the only thing she had ever been able to fully trust, and she was not going to stop trusting it now. The door opened. Carver came back in and took his seat, and the room went completely silent, in the way rooms go silent when something is about to be said that cannot be unsaid. He looked at the papers in front of him. He looked at Pryor. He looked at the Federal Observer. He said, "I've reviewed the submission from Mrs. Calloway." Pryor started to rise. Carver held up one hand without looking at him, and Pryor sat back down with the controlled expression of a man swallowing something unpleasant. "The entry number discrepancy identified in the certified Cheyenne register copy is not a clerical matter," Carver said. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man choosing each word with awareness that it was being recorded and observed. Entry 4471 in the 1864 notarial log corresponds to a documented parcel description that does not match the property described in Mr. Mercer's deed. This is a factual inconsistency that cannot be attributed to administrative error. The room shifted. Clara felt it a collective breath held differently than before. Furthermore, Carver continued, the testimony of Mr. Holt Ferris as a direct witness to the 1865 continuous ownership confirmation establishes a chain of legitimate title that predates and supersedes the contested deed. He paused. The court finds insufficient legal basis to transfer ownership of the Calloway property at this time. The deed presented by Mr. Mercer is referred to the Federal Land Office for further investigation into its origin and authenticity. He set the papers down. "This hearing is concluded." The room erupted, not violent sound. People talking all at once, chairs scraping Pryor on his feet, shouting something about appeal. Mercer's men at the back wall shifting with the restless energy of a situation that had not gone the way they'd been positioned to expect. Mercer himself didn't shout. He sat very still at his table and looked across the room at Clara with an expression she felt on her skin like temperature, not hot cold. The cold of a man recalculating, not conceding. She looked back at him. She did not look away first. Ethan's hand found her elbow not gripping just present, and he said quietly near her ear, "We need to move, now, before Pryor files the appeal and tries to get a temporary injunction to freeze the property." "I know," she said. "Get Ferris." They moved through the crowded room with the controlled speed of people who understood that winning a courtroom moment and winning the situation were two different things, and Mercer still had money and lawyers and time, and the next 12 hours mattered as much as the last 6 weeks. In the hallway, the Federal Observer was waiting. He introduced himself as Agent Collum from the Denver Land Office. He was younger than Clara had expected, mid-30s, with a methodical manner and the particular alertness of someone who had read her letters carefully. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "your documentation is thorough." "Is it sufficient for a federal investigation?" she asked directly. "It's sufficient to open one," he said, "which is what I'm recommending. The entry number fraud is clear enough for our purposes. What we'll need is the time to establish the full scope, whether this is an isolated deed or part of a broader pattern." "It's broader," Clara said. "In El Paso, I worked for a man named Caldwell who ran an identical scheme. Land brokerage forged entry numbers, witness elimination. I was never able to prove Caldwell's connection to anyone outside El Paso, but the methodology is identical." She paused. "I'd be willing to provide a full written account of what I observed under Caldwell's employ, if it's useful to the federal investigation." Collum looked at her steadily. "It would be very useful. Then you'll have it within the week." Ethan was watching her. She could feel it. She kept her eyes on Collum. "One thing," she said. "The investigation needs to move before Mercer can move assets. He'll know by tonight that Denver is involved. If he has documentation he wants to disappear, he'll begin that process immediately." "I'm aware," Collum said. He closed his document case. "I'll be wiring Denver within the hour." He looked at Ethan. "Mr. Calloway, your land is yours. What happens to Mercer is now a federal matter." He left. The hallway was quieter now. Most of the crowd had poured back into the street. Holt Ferris stood nearby with his hat in his hands, watching Clara with an expression she didn't fully know how to read. "Your father would have liked her," Ferris said to Ethan. Not quietly, he meant for Clara to hear it. Ethan looked at her. "Yes," he said. "He would have." Clara felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she refused to authorize. "We should get back," she said. "Mercer knows where the ranch is." They rode home together. The three of them, Ferris on a borrowed horse, the afternoon going gold and long around them, and nobody said much for the first mile, because sometimes what has happened needs a mile of silence before it becomes real. Mercer came that night, not himself. He was too careful for that now, with federal eyes on him. But 4 men came to the edge of the Calloway property after dark, and they came with intention, and the intention was not subtle. Clara heard them first. She had not slept. She had been at the table writing the account for Collum, the full El Paso record. Caldwell's methods, every forged document she could name, every witness she could identify when she heard the horses. Too many for one rider moving with the specific hesitation of men who are trying to be quiet and aren't quite succeeding. She was at Ethan's door in 4 steps. 4 riders, she said through the door. East boundary. He was out in 15 seconds, dressed rifle in hand. He looked at her. "Ferris," she said. "Already up," Ferris said from the main room. The old man was standing in the dark with a calm that came from having been in this kind of situation before in a different decade on different land. "I heard them a minute ago." Ethan moved to the front window. "They're not coming to the house," he said after a moment. "They're at the barn site." The burned barn, the ash and the ruined frame. "They're going to finish it," Clara said. "Everything that wasn't destroyed in the fire, the equipment, the remaining structure." "Or they're sending a message," Ethan said. "Last chance. Back down or it gets worse." "It won't get worse," Clara said. Both men looked at her. Collum telegraphed Denver tonight. By morning, this property is under federal observation as an active investigation site. Mercer's men know that destroying property here after tonight creates federal obstruction charges. She kept her voice even. "They're not here to destroy anything. They're here to see if you'll come out angry. They're here to provoke." A silence. "So we don't go out," Ethan said. "We light the lamps," Clara said. "Every lamp in the house, and we wait." Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Ferris, you want coffee?" Ferris said, "I've been wanting coffee since Cheyenne." Clara lit the lamps. The riders stayed at the east boundary for 40 minutes. Then they left. Nobody fired a shot. Nobody came to the door. Nobody was given a reason for anything other than 4 men sitting on horses in the dark, looking at a lit house on land that was no longer as simple to take as it had been yesterday morning. When the sound of hooves faded completely, Ethan set the rifle against the wall and sat down at the table. Ferris poured the coffee. Clara sat across from Ethan, and they looked at each other in the lamplight, and the house was quiet in the way it sometimes was, the good kind of quiet, the kind with weight and meaning in it. "It's not over," Ethan said. He wasn't being pessimistic. He was being accurate. "No," Clara agreed. "The federal investigation will take months. Mercer will fight every step. Pryor will file appeals and motions and delays and make it expensive." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "But the core question, who owns this land, is answered. The rest is noise." "Expensive noise," he said. "Yes," she said, "but survivable noise." He looked at her. "You're staying," he said. It wasn't entirely a question. She looked back at him. "I told you in the courthouse hallway that I was considering it seriously," she said. "I've had several hours to consider it further." She paused. "The federal account I'm writing for Column requires access to my El Paso documentation. My El Paso documentation is in San Antonio in a lockbox." She paused again. "Someone would need to retrieve it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "That's a 4-day ride." "Round trip," she said. "If you were going, I'd come. If I was going," he said slowly, "you'd come." "I'd come," she confirmed. Ferris looked into his coffee cup with the specific focus of a man pretending not to be listening. "And after San Antonio," Ethan said. "After San Antonio," Clara said carefully. "I imagine there would be more work. The investigation, the documentation, the appeal process." She met his eyes. "There's generally more work." He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the courthouse hallway, with the expression of a man who had asked a question in a language he wasn't entirely fluent in, and had received an answer in the same language, and was still working out the full meaning of it. But working it out with something in his face that she had not seen there in their first weeks together. Something that was not just relief or gratitude or professional respect. Something that had no clean category, and therefore she decided she would stop trying to categorize it and simply allow it to exist. "All right," he said. Ferris put his cup down and said he was going to bed, and he said it with the dignity of a man gracefully removing himself from something that didn't require him. They sat alone in the lamplight. After a moment, Ethan said, "Tell me something." "What?" "The first night. After Mercer came to the porch. You sat at this table and you wrote in your notebook. What were you writing?" She looked at him. "How did you know?" "I came out for water at midnight and saw the light under the kitchen door," he said. "I didn't come in." She considered this. "I was writing the document analysis," she said, "the precise version. At midnight. Precision is better when everything else is uncertain," she said. "It's something I can trust." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you became a bookkeeper?" She looked at him. It was not a simple question, dressed as a simple question. It was a real one, and he knew it was a real one, and the fact that he was asking meant something about where they had arrived. "My mother died when I was 11, she said. "My father was not present in the ways that mattered. I learned very early that numbers don't lie. Documents don't change their story based on how you feel that day." She paused. "People do. Numbers don't." She looked at her hands. "So yes, that's why." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, My father used to say that the land doesn't care what you feel about it. It just is what it is, and you either work it or you don't. He looked at the table. I think I spent a lot of years thinking that was wisdom. Now I think maybe he was just lonely and didn't know how to say so. Clara looked at him. I think, she said carefully, that people who need things to be fixed and certain sometimes become very good at their work and very bad at other things. He met her eyes. Yes, he said. I'm one of those people, she said. So am I, he said. The lamp between them was burning low. Neither of them moved to refill it. 3 weeks later, Silas Mercer was formally indicted by the Federal Land Office on 4 counts of document fraud and 1 count of witness interference relating to the disappearance of the 2 original ownership witnesses. The indictment cited the Cheyenne Register evidence and Holt Ferris's testimony and Clara's written account of the El Paso scheme as establishing a pattern of conduct that constituted deliberate and systematic fraud. Pryor filed 2 appeals. Both were denied. Mercer's assets were frozen pending the federal case. His men drifted out of Red Rock within a fortnight, the way men drift when the money stops and the orders stop and the reason for being somewhere evaporates. The 2 properties he had acquired through similar means were placed under federal review, and the families on those properties were notified that their ownership was being restored pending final ruling. Red Rock changed the way towns change when the thing that had been pressing on them is lifted, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small adjustments. Pete Alden from the feed store stopped making comments. Vera Dutton, the authority on other people's marriages, was seen nodding at Clara on the sidewalk one Tuesday morning in what could generously be described as acknowledgement. Sheriff Holt filed the barn fire report with full documentation and submitted it to the federal case file, which was the most useful thing he had done in the entire affair. The little girl with the gap tooth came to the ranch one afternoon with her mother, ostensibly to return a borrowed preserving jar, and spent 45 minutes following Clara around the kitchen, asking questions about bookkeeping that suggested she had been thinking about numbers in the way Clara had once begun thinking about them as something more reliable than most things. Clara answered every question. Ethan built the new barn. He didn't do it alone. 3 ranchers from the neighboring properties came the first Saturday, then 4 more the next. And the structure went up the way things go up in communities that have remembered what they're for. Clara kept water and coffee coming and listened to the men talk, and noticed that they talked to Ethan differently than they had in those first weeks, not deferentially, not with the particular wariness of men, unsure of someone's standing, but plainly. The way men talk to someone whose position is settled. She thought about what settled meant. She went to San Antonio and retrieved her El Paso documents. Ethan came with her. It was a 4-day trip as she had predicted, and on the 2nd day riding back through country that was neither Red Rock nor San Antonio, but simply itself open and indifferent and very large. Ethan said something she hadn't expected. I fixed the porch rail, he said. She looked at him. When? Before we left. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. I'd been meaning to for 12 years. I kept telling myself I'd get to it. He paused. I got to it. She understood what he was not saying directly. She said, How does it look? Straight, he said. For the first time in 30 years, that rail is straight. She looked at the road ahead. Good, she said. On the 4th day, they came back over the low bridge, and she heard the creak. Before she saw it, that cold, clean sound she had learned to locate without trying, the way you learn the sounds of a place that has become yours. And the word yours arrived in her chest with a completeness that startled her. Not because it was a new thought, because it was no longer a thought she was holding at a careful distance to examine. It had settled. The way a thing settles when it's found the place it belongs. Ethan heard the creak too. She saw it in the slight adjustment of his shoulders, not tenser, looser, the same thing that happened to her. They unsaddled in the yard and carried their bags in, and the house smelled like the coffee that had been sitting cold in the pot since they'd left 4 days ago, and like the wood of the walls, and like the particular combination of things that had no single name, but that she had begun to think of as home. She set her bag down. He set his bag down. She turned to say something practical about the cold coffee, and the fact that they should probably eat before she looked at the federal documents, and he was already looking at her. Not the way he'd looked at her in the first weeks, the careful assessing look of a man calculating proximity. The way he was looking at her now had no calculation in it. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. The word came out quieter than she intended. "I know we agreed on 6 months," he said. "We did agree on that," she said. "I know the 6 months is nearly up." "In 11 days," she said, because she had known the number for weeks and had been deciding what to do with it. "I know you have standing of your own now," he said. "The federal work. Column's office has already asked for you by name for the next case. You could go to Denver and build something entirely separate from this." He stopped. "From here." She looked at him steadily. "I could," she said. "I'm not asking you to stay," he said. "I'm telling you I want you to. Those are different things, and I want to be clear about which one this is." She held his gaze. "You're telling me you want me to stay," she said. "Yes." "Not because of the federal case?" "No." "Not because of the land?" "The land is settled," he said. "This is about something that isn't settled." He paused. "Unless you don't want it to be." Clara stood in the kitchen of a house with a straight porch rail and a cold creek running along the east fence and a new barn that smelled like fresh lumber. And she thought about numbers that don't lie, and documents that don't change their story, and all the ways she had organized her life around things that held still because people didn't. And she thought about a man who had given her a separate room without being asked, and who had stepped forward in a doorway, and who had said, "That's not what I asked," and who had laughed, really laughed, when she told him the telegram was already drafted. She thought about "Tell me something we can do." She said, "I want it to be settled." Something moved across Ethan's face. The kind of movement that comes from a feeling that is too large and too real to be completely contained. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. He didn't reach for her the way men reached. He stopped in front of her and put his hand against her face, the way you touch something you've been afraid to want for too long, carefully, completely present, asking with the gesture rather than assuming. She put her hand over his. She said, "The cold coffee needs to be dealt with." He almost laughed. Almost. "Right now?" "In a moment," she said. "In a moment." Outside, the creek ran cold and clean along the east fence. The new barn stood straight in the late light. The porch rail held level and true. And inside in the kitchen where they had sat across from each other for 6 weeks, with the careful distance of 2 people who didn't yet know how much they would come to mean to each other. Ethan Calloway and Clara Whitmore stood with no distance between them at all. She had come to Red Rock with a leather satchel and a magnifying lens and a notebook and nowhere else to go. She had found fraud and fought it and documented it and won. She had found a man who asked what she needed instead of telling her, who stepped forward instead of back, who fixed the porch rail because something had finally become worth staying for. And she had found in the wreckage of a 6-month arrangement built on necessity and desperation the one thing she had stopped believing she was allowed to want. Not rescue, not safety borrowed from someone stronger. A place where her particular kind of strength was not just tolerated, but needed, where the numbers she trusted and the documents she read and the precision she had built her survival around were the exact tools that had saved everything worth saving. She had not come here to be loved, but she had stayed because she was. And in Red Rock, in the territory of the American West, in a house with a straight porch rail and a cold creek and a new barn, and 2 people who had learned the hard and necessary way that trust is not given, but built one small, honest action at a time, that was not a small thing. That was everything.